Okay, so this video isn't going to have the usual joke to commentary ratio that y'all become accustomed to because frankly, getting to this point was exhausting and I have no more humor left for this topic. Secondly, this video will be the last time that I use woke as a pejorative because I slowly feel myself morphing into dollar store Jason Whitlock. Diabetes and all. Lastly, I want to make this clear for those of you who have started following the channel at any point during the past few months because I feel like I've been giving off some mixed signals in that time. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again for posterity, that I never really intended to talk about Dave, or at least not in the context that I feel like everybody with a Twitter handle and a post has been, because everyone with a Twitter handle and a post has given their 2 cents on how alpha or ass backwards they think Dave is. And I know it won't get me that sweet click rate clip I'm looking for, but I've always been the type to march to the beat of my own meat. So even though I could make like a 10 video series about how right or wrong I think Dave is or isn't, I'm not going to do that. I've said it at least twice now that Dave is my favorite comic, which is a big reason why I didn't trust myself to be objective about the discourse surrounding him, which is why I really tried my best to stay out of it. And I'll admit that at this point in his career, Dave has shown a greater tendency to punch down at all his critics and not just the trans ones, a little more often than for my liking at least. And frankly, I feel like he's better than that. Even if in the process, he's making some honest to God good points that get lost in all the low effort punchlines. And therein lies the issue. My problem was never about Dave, but it was about people with the platform and clout to do and know better, waving Dave's points off as little more than bad faith arguments, even if in context they were. My argument was always that even if you don't like the way or even the reason why Dave started the conversation, the door has been opened now. And frankly, a lot of us, myself included, wanted to stay open until what's behind it is finally resolved. But that's not what happened. And it doesn't feel like it's going to happen anytime soon. Again, it just got brushed to the side like 45's haircut. But even then, I was just going to keep my trap shut until the outrage onslaught had subsided. But then this happened, and I haven't been able to disengage from the discourse since. If there is one thing that I do hate about Black America, male, female, young, old, straight, gay, trans, and everything in between, is some of our propensity to let actors who historically have been complicit, if not active in our oppression, gas us up to hate each other just to get left holding a nut after the interests of those actors are fulfilled. And I know a lot of my white audience won't like hearing that, but understand something. I don't have an issue with straight Black men being critiqued by people outside that demographic. I mean, I do it to white people all the time, and it's hilarious. But you notice something about like 80% of my videos. Believe it or not, I put a lot of work into these videos, and like 75% of that work is research. And that's because I go out of my way to give as fair a critique as possible. Why? Because as a Black man, I know all too well how harmful generalizations can be, especially to already marginalized groups. And that buckles and buckets is my issue. When you make harmful generalizations about people based on personal experiences, or worse, a fallacy based on an unfounded and even manufactured narrative. And I feel like ever since the anti-closer crusade began, that's all I've been seeing. Generalization after fallacy after bold-faced lie about the scourge that is straight Black manhood, using Dave, Kanye, and most recently Will and Chris as vehicles to perpetuate these harmful narratives about us. And frankly, it's equal parts frustrating, infuriating, exhausting, and disheartening. Because as a Black father, husband, son, brother, and most importantly, a man, y'all who insist on perpetuating these statistically bunked narratives say to me and people like me that nothing we ever do will be good enough to disprove your bull. Because believe me, I've heard all your BS for virtually my whole life, and I've spent the bulk of it trying to be the exception until I met another me, and then another, and then another, until ultimately I realized something, that I'm not an exception. But me being the analytical Buzz Killington that I am, just meeting other me's wasn't enough to base an argument on. Something we'll come back to later. The purpose of this video isn't to deny anyone's personal experience. In fact, growing up around anywhere from 2 to like 5 or 6 single black women at a time, I've seen for myself what happens when sentient trash bags abuse black women's grace. Additionally, as I've said multiple times on this channel, statistically, there is no demographic in America that is more vulnerable or historically oppressed than black and indigenous women. I'm also not going to waste time trying to refute every single narrative because one, for the most part, I've already done that in past videos, the links to which I'll leave in the description. And two, like I said, I'm already tired of this topic and I don't feel like spending any more time than what's necessary on it. Rather, what I'm going to attempt to do is reframe how we talk about toxic masculinity, blackness, and the convergence of those things, because I feel like that's the root of this sprawling BS tree. Okay, so first we have to ask ourselves, what is masculinity anyway? Put simply, it's traits and behaviors that, at least in a patriarchal society, are traditionally associated with man and boyhood. How far you can throw a ball, how many logs you can carry on your back at one time, how many cheeks you can clap in a day before your balls shrivel like overcooked bacon. I'm hungry now. But it's also things like courage, leadership, assertiveness, independence, you know, all those things politicians are supposed to have. My point is, in a patriarchal society, these traits are valued more highly than traits we commonly associate with femininity, like kindness or empathy, for example. I guess that explains this, doesn't it? In a patriarchal society, a man who is perceived as lacking in the former traits is considered lacking, period, and therefore unworthy, not just as a man, but as a human being. So to overcompensate, or at least in an attempt to surpass his social, professional, or romantic rivals, some men will exaggerate their masculine traits or overindulge the ones they can control to mask their deficiency in the ones they can't. This, folks, is called hypermasculinity, the over-exaggeration of traditionally masculine traits. So literally this scene from back when Family Guy was still watchable. Which now brings me to the point of the video I know you've all been waiting for. The term toxic masculinity originated in the mytho-poetic men's movement of the 80s and early 90s, a movement largely inspired by the ideas of, well, that was unexpected. Mytho-poets argued that modern forces like social institutions, industrialization, and you're not going to believe this one, feminism of all things, have redefined and muted what being a man really meant. We'd become competitors instead of comrades, fighters instead of fathers. We've been conditioned from boyhood to be emotionless automatons and dissuaded by society from bonding with other men the way women do. All this caused us to adopt a toxic masculinity defined more by what society expects from us than who we were really meant to be. I mean, you could choose to agree or disagree or anything in between, but my point is that toxic masculinity was never intended to be accusatory the way popular culture uses it now. And that, I think, is where the problem lies. In the early 2010s, the term started gaining widespread use in academia, and like clockwork, once popular culture got a hold of it, we co-opted it, bastardized, and dare I say, commodified the term for our own purposes. Sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? My point is, if we're going to have a good faith conversation about toxic masculinity, we have to stop using it as an umbrella term for all the negative qualities we associate with patriarchy, like misogyny and homophobia, for example, which would be better understood, at least in my opinion, as hypermasculine traits. Instead, we need to acknowledge that our popular understanding of manhood is flawed to the point of it being toxic. But it is just as much to men as it is the society we live in. Further, we need to ask, well, how the F did we get here in the first place? And is there anything we can do to rectify that? And that's where we need to start the conversation about black masculinity. Why do black people, in a general sense, of course, understand and practice manhood in the manner which we do? Once we answer that, then we need to ask, why is such an understanding toxic to black boys, black men, and further, the black community at large? And finally, even though a lot of y'all don't want to hear this, we need to ask ourselves, how do we heal black men and boys of that toxicity? And how do we heal women who have been affected by it? I think it's safe to say that black men, generally speaking, have a propensity for hypermasculinity. It's in our music, our movies, our language, hell, even our religion. But the question is, why though? This is why. As we've established, hypermasculinity more often than not is a defense mechanism designed to cover masculine insecurity. In patriarchal societies, a man's worth is directly correlated to his ability to do two things: protect and provide. Think about it. Every traditionally masculine trait serves as a means to achieve one or both of those ends. Even a man's sexuality comes back to his ability to provide his partner or partners with pleasure, even offspring. And I'd even argue protect himself from the embarrassment of they finding it somewhere else. I mean, why do you think that there's a whole industry based on penis insecurity when the average cooter is only like 4 to 5 inches deep anyway? So riddle me this. What if you're a man in a society that tells you that your worth is predicated on how well you can protect and provide, but then goes out of his way to prevent you from doing that? Now, what if that same society systematically dehumanized and emasculated you literally and figuratively to inflate its own sense of self? Exactly. Okay, so it's BS meter time. I saw a little while back an article on a black feminist forum that tried to argue that black emasculation was not a thing because, well, actually, emasculation only qualifies if you're physically castrated. Which, FYI, that actually did happen, dumbass. And two, even if it didn't, okay, I'm not going to get into it because this video is already going to be long enough without my usual brand of tangential anecdotes. But I will say that this is a prime example of what I talked about earlier. People being so quick to adopt a narrative that explains their own condition without actually knowing what the they're talking about. Anyway, black men were legally not allowed to be fathers in the traditional sense. Those of us with families in Africa were separated from them, if not at the slave depot on the coast, then at the auction block in Jamestown. Those of us born into slavery suffered the same fate on the reg, while being rendered unable to protect ourselves or our peers from physical and emotional trauma endured at the whipping post. We had to sit back and watch in silent rage as our mothers, wives, and daughters were regularly abused for our oppressors' gratification. And though it didn't happen nearly as much, there are documented instances of male-on-male sexual abuse in North American slavery time. Like I said earlier, it was not out of the realm of reality for black men to be literally castrated as both a preventative measure and a warning to any other uppity Negroes to keep their eyes off of Sally Mae's porcelain gams. But this one right here, man, let me just tell you the story. In reading about instances of homosexual abuse of black men during slavery, I came across a story about a 1787 incident in Maryland, in which an enslaved black man was forced at gunpoint by two whites to rape a free black woman. And no, nothing happened to those men, because why would it, genius? Point being, it was not uncommon for black men to be weaponized against the very people society, and in my opinion, our instinct tells us to protect. Not unlike what some of y'all are doing today, but the difference is this right here is a choice. But We'll come back to that a little later on. And if you think all of that just ended after watch night, then you're obviously a Southerner, because now here comes Jim Crow and the Klan and the dismantling of the Freedmen's Bureau and the retraction of Special Field Order Number 15, which is where that whole 40 acres and a mule thing comes from, and the lynch mobs and Tulsa and Seneca Hill and the longest and deadliest period of domestic terrorism in U.S. history, and mass incarceration, and the dismantling of the civil rights and black power movements, and the drug war, and the crack epidemic, which legitimized it, which was facilitated by the U.S. government, and the biggest obstacle of them all, big booty white girls, obviously. I'm really trying to get through this video without bursting an aneurysm, but it really baffles me how obtuse and unempathetic some people can be for nothing but their own self-interest. Like, it's right there in the effing book. Just open it up and read it. Or better yet, you can spend your time Googling that instead of how to spin alopecia into an AIDS diagnosis. Okay, I'm not going to go there. Let's just stick to the task at hand. Moving on. My point is, it's hard to be black in America. And being a black man in a society that has historically prevented you from fulfilling its qualifications for manhood, well, what do you think is going to happen? Even as someone raised in an environment that was predominantly single black and female, I was instilled with hyper masculine traits from boyhood. I mean, I had a girlfriend by the time I was like 6, or better yet, I was given a girlfriend because, can't let the boy grow up to be a sissy after all. I also got into a lot of fights in my elementary and middle school years. Not necessarily at school always. In fact, by the time I got to high school, I rarely actually fought in school. But like I said in an older video, when I did fight, whether consciously or not, I did so to protect my manhood. Because you see, I got bullied pretty regularly as a kid. But those hyper masculine traits I told you about conditioned me not to seek an adult for help, but to physically take my manhood back, or sometimes from someone else. Remember what I said in the Kendrick Lamar video about hood justice? This isn't the sole or even main reason why such a thing exists, but it is a factor. One that isn't addressed, let alone talked about nearly as much as liberal and conservative white people's favorite scapegoat, the devil's rap music, of course. Which, while I'm on it, yes, historically there has been a heavy presence of misogyny and homophobia in rap music, although in like the past decade or so, the genre and the community, at least relative to its history, has made some pretty big strides away from that. Now, he doesn't count. But again, why though? Like I spent 3 whole videos discussing, rap music is a product of the environment where it was created. Specifically, the inner city, where poverty and its club-footed offspring crime are endemic. And like I said in the Will Smith video, poverty and its causes are the best predictors of domestic abuse, a trait that traditionally is associated with toxic masculinity, although we'll talk about that later as well. My point being, when critiquing rap music based on the high presence, even glorification of hypermasculine attitudes and behaviors, you gotta ask yourself, is this a chicken or the egg first situation? Is rap music a reflection of black men's inherent distrust, distaste, and disrespect for anything or one they consider effeminate? Or is rap music's hypermasculine traits a manifestation of black men's attempts to overcompensate for their historical emasculation? I don't know. That's up to you to decide for yourself, but this gets into my problem with how we frame the discourse surrounding toxic masculinity and its presence in the black community. Like I said earlier, I was going to keep my mouth out of the convo surrounding Dave because 1, I didn't and still don't fully trust myself to be objective, and 2, I didn't want to get sucked into a hole trying to explain the nuance of my position to people who evidently don't know what that word means. But this article here, combined with that whole Dave hates poor people thing, got me off the bench and right into the squabble. My problem is that I sat here and read this entire article twice and not once did I feel like any of her argument was being made in good faith. Rather, this was the author using Dave as a vehicle to vent her frustration with how trans women are treated by the Black community, which again, not a problem. The problem is that she uses Dave as an excuse to generalize straight Black cisgendered men as abusing Black women's protection of them, not just from society, but accountability, and even at times, culpability, to the detriment of the rest of Black America. Which I said before is prime grade bull feces, based on the numbers at least. And I feel like a part of her knows this because for as unnecessarily long as this article is, the author spends the bulk of her time telling personal anecdotes from both her and her colleagues' experiences to support her claims. In fact, the one time she does use actual honest-to-God data, she misrepresents it for her own interests. Yeah, same freaking energy. The data in question says that Black women are 2.5 times more likely than white women to experience domestic violence, which is true. But what she conveniently omits from her narrative, and something we covered in the Will Smith video, is that Black men are also overrepresented as domestic abuse victims, trailing Black women by only 5 percentage points. She also conveniently omits the fact that the rate of domestic violence among gay and bisexual Black women is much higher than the rate among heteros. But you don't see anyone out here beating the drum against toxic Black lesbianism now, do you? Well, most people at least. And again, none of this gets to the root cause, which is pop. Never mind, we said no tangents, let's just move on. The author insists on her narrative without any quantitative or qualitative evidence to back it up. And no, a handful of commentary excerpts doesn't count. Not once does she mention the high rate of religiosity of Black Americans and how that influences, if not dictates, our generally conservative attitudes on reproductive rights, sexuality, family structure, etc. That's because she doesn't care about giving you an honest narrative. She's just hell-bent on painting straight Black men in a particular light to support her own cause. Same freaking energy. Look, if you want to argue that the historical oppression of Black people and the social and economic implications of that, combined with American patriarchal attitudes about manhood, creates unique challenges to addressing both toxic and hypermasculinity in Black America, then so be it. But don't frame your argument as you denouncing some form of exclusively Black patriarchy. That's when I have a problem. And that's when I gotta throw the book at you. The history book, to be specific. May I refer you to the Black Power movement, which not only confirms her takes are just as bad as they sound, but reinforces the point I made earlier about Black men's historical emasculation. The Black Power movement wasn't just about dismantling systems of racial oppression, but it was also about redefining Black man and womanhood in a white patriarchal society, because this wasn't going to cut it anymore. So Black people, being Black, looked to Africa for guidance. The problem was, more often than not, Black men, no doubt influenced by Western ideas of masculinity, adopted a reductivist idea of African manhood and insisted that that be the new order. For example, early in its history, the US organization, something of an on-again, off-again frenemy of the Black Panthers, mandated polygamy and insisted that women adopt the subjugated or submissive role within the family. But by the mid-70s, Maulana Karenga, the org's founder, was denouncing, quote, sexist interpretations of cultural nationalism. In other words, no more mandated menage a trois. Speaking of the Panthers, the party was basically run by women, and this is pretty much common knowledge to anyone who knows where Huey Freeman got his first name. Although the Panthers did harbor some particularly toxic tendencies, like elevating a convicted and unapologetic rapist to leadership within a year of joining the org, the Panthers displayed a capacity to do the one thing that white conservatives fear more than inner city gas station attendants post 9/11. Change. Black female revolutionaries regularly challenged the patriarchal power structures of their orgs, And unlike in mainstream society, many times they succeeded. And they did so by basically proving to the doubters that anything a man could do, they could do just as well, if not better, including suffer for the cause. By the early 70s, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and even Eldridge Cosby himself had all made statements that affirmed women's equality and denounced male chauvinism, including threatening to discipline anyone within the org who exhibited such behavior or attitudes. Additionally, Newton and Seale both emphasized the importance of black men combating all forms of oppression, including misogyny and homophobia. In fact, in 1965, when the controversial Moynihan Report was published and declared that black men were rendered unable to fulfill their proper role due to a matriarchal family structure, Black Panther leaders agreed, but said that this was due to racist social structures as opposed to tangled pathology, as the Moynihan Report declared. Also, by 1974, women were not only practically, but literally running the BPP, when Elaine Brown became chair and appointed women to several key leadership roles. Granted, by this point, the BPP was a shell of its former self, and most of the only people left to run it were women. But my point is that within the Black Power movement, women were heard in a way that they rarely were in mainstream society. And no, it wasn't just in a put black men first and our rights will trickle down kind of way. Black women regularly put reproductive rights and domestic abuse at the top of their oppression hit list, even if those discussions weren't always met warmly. But the point is, they were had, something that this author insists historically doesn't happen in Black America. The irony is that for as marginalized as the author purports black women to be by black men, past and recent history says that liberal white women habitually silence their colored allies concerning issues that either specifically or disproportionately impact colored women, while simultaneously weaponizing those same voices against whoever they perceive as oppressors. And I'm sick to death of y'all playing dummy every time somebody brings that point up. Growing up in the black church tradition, I can't sit here and cap like patriarchal attitudes haven't characterized our communities. But like I said earlier, that has just as much, if not more, to do with bad exegesis than it does blackness. Otherwise, this book wouldn't have needed writing. So my point is, stop generalizing black men based on a flawed, if not false, narrative, because that's easier to do than looking at an effing graph for once in your life. The purpose of this video isn't to deny anyone's personal truth, but it is to say that it's wrong, and if you're a journalist, downright shameful to use your personal experience as a blanket truth for an entire demographic when the data doesn't support you. Remember what I said about white girls and me never being comfortable enough with one to get romantically involved? Did I ever use my experience to characterize the entire Snow Bunny Nation? No. Because me doing that would not only be unfair, but harmful to the Beckys. I said this video would be the last time I use woke as a pejorative because regardless of how badly it's been corrupted and co-opted, at its core, wokeness, real wokeness, and not whatever this is still necessary. To be woke means to make oneself aware of systems and institutions, and furthermore, the brokers within who create, control, and manipulate narratives for their own end. With that being said, I feel like our microwave, fast food, TikTok society has conditioned us to be so woke to the point that we're asleep. In other words, we're conditioned now to consistently miss the forest for the trees, even when we're standing right in the middle of one. At this point, frankly, I don't care about how some of y'all feel about and toward black men because I'm tired of feeling like I'm talking to a brick wall anyway. But I just want it to be said, if not by anyone else, then at least by me, that we're not who y'all say we are. I'm not saying that a lot of black men don't dismiss the plight of other marginalized groups for their own benefit. I'm also not saying that a lot of us don't need to come up tremendously as far as not just hearing, but listening to black voices aside from our own. If being a man in America does mean being a leader, then it's black men's duty to empower not just women, but all blacks in the ways and areas that mainstream society has neglected. That being said, if the conversation is going to be had, this right here ain't the way you start it.